The door was open when she asked me in. Not all the way, just enough. The way old houses breathe in late summer. Pulling the outside inside, whether you want it or not. I was standing in my driveway holding a bag of mulch I'd already forgotten about. And she was on her porch steps with her hair still damp from a shower and a coffee mug that said something I couldn't read from 10 feet away. She'd caught me looking. I knew it. She knew it. And instead of going inside and pretending it hadn't happened, she tilted her head and said, quietly, "Come in for a minute. I've got something I need help with." I said, "Sure." I don't know what I thought would happen after that, but I remember thinking as I set that bag of mulch down against the fence post and walked across the yard that I should have kept my eyes to myself. That some things, once you start looking, you can't stop. Let me back up. My name is Draper. I'm 38 years old, and I repair things for a living. Not restoration. I'm not sanding century-old armoires in a temperature-controlled workshop somewhere. I'm the guy you call when your boiler stops in January, or your deck boards are rotting through, or your gutters are pulling away from the fascia in a way that's gonna matter in about 3 months. I work for myself. Which means I work all the time. Which means when I'm home in the evening, I'm usually too tired to want anything more complicated than a beer and whatever game's on. That had been my life for about 2 years since my ex-wife, Lauren, moved out of the house I still lived in and into an apartment in a part of town I didn't drive through anymore. The divorce wasn't ugly. That was almost worse. It was just quiet. 2 people who'd stopped knowing how to be alone together. Splitting into 2 people who would each just be alone. I kept the house. I kept the dog. A 6-year-old beagle named Hank, who slept at the foot of the bed and snored like a man twice his size. I kept my tools and my truck and my routine, and I told myself it was enough. That I'd built a good, simple life, not a lonely one. I said that to myself for 2 years. The woman across the yard was named Mara Voss. She'd moved into the rental next door in early April. I knew because I'd been replacing the sill plate on my side of the fence that week and watched the moving truck pull in. She'd brought 3 people to help her, a tall guy with a beard, who I later learned was her brother, 2 women about her age, and a collection of plants that seemed like too many for one person to reasonably keep alive. I remember thinking she had a lot of plants. I remember noticing that. I didn't introduce myself that first week. I'm not someone who crosses the yard to introduce himself. I wave. I nod. I hold the line of being friendly without being a project. That was how I'd operated with the previous tenants. A young couple who'd barely been there 6 months. And the elderly man before them, who'd left birdhouses on every fence post and never once started a conversation that lasted less than 45 minutes. I'd liked him. I missed the birdhouses, but I didn't cross yards to say so. I noticed Mara the way you notice things when you spend a lot of time outside and your neighbor spends a lot of time outside. She was up early. I saw her lights on before mine most mornings. And by the time I was backing out of the driveway, she was usually already on her porch with that coffee mug. Sometimes reading. Sometimes just sitting. She worked from home, I gathered. She moved through the day at a pace that seemed deliberate, not slow. Just unhurried in a way that made you notice the contrast with everything around her. She had a wind chime on her porch that drove me slightly insane for the first 2 weeks, and then I stopped hearing it. That's how long it took. She waved back when I waved. She nodded. She held the line. The first time we actually talked was a Thursday evening in May. About 3 weeks after she moved in, I was on my deck with Hank and she was working on something at her porch railing, some kind of potted arrangement that wasn't going well, and she looked over and said, across the yard, "Do you know anything about drainage?" Not as a question, more like a statement she was making to the air between us. I said I knew a little. She said, "These pots are drowning. Everything I plant drowns." I told her most potting soil sold at hardware stores doesn't drain the way it says it does. I told her what to look for. She listened. She didn't say thank you immediately, she absorbed it first. The way people do when they're actually filing information away rather than waiting for their turn to respond. Then she said, "That explains a lot," and went back to what she was doing. That was it. 4 minutes. Maybe. I went back inside and watched the game. But I noticed the chime again that night, not in an annoying way, just present. By June, I knew her schedule the way you know your neighbor's schedule when you're both people who spend time outside. She got groceries on Wednesdays. She ran in the morning. Long routes. Came back looking like she'd gone somewhere and returned with information. On Saturdays, she worked on the porch in the afternoon and played music I couldn't quite identify from my yard, something with piano, something that moved at its own pace. She had one friend who came over regularly, a woman named Diane who drove a red Subaru and always brought a bottle of something. Her brother called on Sunday evenings. I could hear her voice change lighter. Shorter sentences. The cadence of someone talking to family. I wasn't tracking her. I was just paying attention. There's a difference. I told myself that. What I also noticed, and I'm telling this honestly, the way you tell a story when you know how it ends and you're tired of explaining yourself, was the coffee mug. It was white with a small illustration of a bird on it. A blue-gray bird I couldn't name from across the yard. She used it every morning without exception. On the morning it rained so hard she could only stand just inside the doorway. She was still holding it. On the morning she'd clearly been up half the night, I could see it in the way she sat. Pulled in, elbows on knees, she was still holding it. The mug was a constant. It was the one thing I could have told you about her before I knew anything else. I noticed that I'd started noticing the mug. I didn't examine that particular observation too closely. June went by. Then, most of July. The summer got the specific kind of hot that makes everything slow down and smell like it's drying out. I was busy a run of jobs in the first half of the month. A kitchen renovation that went sideways because the subfloor was more compromised than the contractor had told the homeowner. 3 weeks of early mornings and long afternoons. I came home tired. I waved at Mara across the yard and she waved back, and that was it. Then it was mid-July. A Sunday afternoon. I was in the driveway doing nothing especially important, loading mulch bags into the truck bed for a job the next morning. Or maybe just standing there the way you stand in your driveway when the day is long and you've run out of productive reasons to go back inside. Hank was investigating the fence line. The air smelled like cut grass from somewhere down the block. And I looked up. Mara was on her porch. Sitting in the chair she always used, a low wooden chair. Painted green. The kind that rocks slightly without being a proper rocking chair. She was reading. Or she had been reading. The book was in her lap. Closed. And she was looking at nothing. The yard. The middle distance. The particular nowhere that people look at when their mind is somewhere else entirely. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough that when she shifted in the chair and her eyes moved and found me across the yard. She didn't look startled. She just looked at me. Steady. And I looked back. And neither of us moved for a count of maybe 3 full seconds. I should have looked away. I didn't. She tilted her head. Not a question exactly. More like she'd decided something. And then she said it. "Come in for a minute. I've got something I need help with." I said sure. I set the mulch bag down. I didn't know what I was walking toward. I told myself it was a plumbing question. A sticky door. A fixture that needed a hand. I told myself a lot of things in the 11 steps between my driveway and her porch stairs. The inside of her house smelled like coffee and something herby, rosemary. Maybe. Or whatever she was growing in the pots on the windowsill that were now. I noticed. Doing considerably better than they had in May. She had more books than I'd expected. Which probably said something about my expectations. She had fewer pieces of furniture. Which made the rooms feel bigger and calmer than mine. And the afternoon light came in through the west window, the way afternoon light in old houses does, warm and a little dusty and honest. She pointed to the hallway. "The closet door," she said. "It won't close. The latch doesn't catch." That was what she needed help with. A closet door. I looked at the door. Hollow core. Standard residential. Probably original to the house, if the house was what I guessed, built in the late 60s. maybe early 70s. Settled in the ways old houses settle. I checked the hinge screws, which had pulled slightly out of the jamb. I checked the strike plate. The latch was hitting low, catching the edge of the plate instead of dropping into the mortise. 5-minute fix if you had a chisel or even just a utility knife and a little patience. I have a utility knife in my truck. I said, 2 minutes. She said, take your time. I went back to the truck. I got the knife and a stubby Phillips. I came back. She was in the kitchen now, not watching me work, which I noticed because most people watch you work when you're fixing something in their house. She was refilling that mug. I could see the mug from the hallway. On the counter, the small blue-gray bird visible even from here. I fixed the door in 6 minutes. I knocked it shut, pulled it open, knocked it shut again. Good, I asked. She came to the hallway. She tested it herself. She didn't just take my word for it, which I respected. Good, she said. Then she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, not guarded, not open, somewhere in between. Like a door held at a specific angle, and she said, I've seen you out there in the mornings, working on the house. Yeah, I said. You always look like you're solving something. She said, even when you're just standing there. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said, occupational hazard. She almost smiled. Not quite. She said, I know the feeling. I drove home that night, home being 11 feet and a property line away, and sat in my kitchen with Hank at my feet and the TV off, and thought about that for longer than I should have. About the way she'd said, I know the feeling. About the mug on her counter. About the expression on her face in the hallway. About 11 steps across a yard. I told myself it was nothing. I've been wrong before. The closet door became a reason to wave differently. I don't know how else to explain it. Before that Sunday, we were neighbors who acknowledged each other across a yard. After it, we were neighbors who'd stood in a hallway together and made something work that hadn't worked before. It's a small thing. I know it's a small thing. But small things are the only currency available when two people are being careful. She started saying good morning. Not just the nod. The actual words. Across the distance. The way you'd say them to someone you'd decided to know a little. I said it back. Hank took to sitting near the fence when he knew she was outside, which was information I noted and filed away under things I wasn't going to analyze. The second week of August, she knocked on my door on a Tuesday evening with a plate covered in foil and said she'd made too much pasta, and here. I thanked her. She left before I could say anything else. The pasta was good, the kind that's been cooked down slow, with garlic and something acidic. And I ate it standing over the sink, the way I eat most things now. And I thought, she knows how to cook for herself, not for company. For herself, there's a difference. I returned the plate on Thursday, washed and dried. She opened the door, looked at the plate, then at me, and said, you didn't have to wash it. I said I was raised in a house where you returned things clean. She said, where was that? And that was how we had our first real conversation. We stood in her doorway for 25 minutes. I learned that she'd grown up in Western Virginia, a small town I'd never been to but knew the general shape of the kind of place where everyone knows your family's history but not necessarily you. She'd left at 18 for a design program, bounced between cities for most of her 20s, and had come here to this specific rental on this specific block because her friend Diane lived 6 minutes away and she needed somewhere that was hers in a way that didn't feel borrowed. The previous place had felt borrowed. She said, someone else's furniture, someone else's idea of what a life should look like. I asked if this place felt different. She looked around the doorframe at the living room behind her. Then she said, it's getting there. I didn't ask about the specifics of why she'd moved. She didn't volunteer them. That kind of restraint, when two people are both practicing it, feels less like withholding and more like an agreement. We both understood there was a version of our histories we weren't sharing yet, and we were each okay with that. What I registered. Standing in that doorway on a warm August night, with her arms crossed loosely across her chest, and the light behind her soft and yellow. She was paying attention to me. Not in a flattering way. Not in a searching way. She was listening the way people listen when they've already decided you're worth listening to. I hadn't been listened to that way in a while. I'd almost forgotten what it felt like. The weight of it settled somewhere in my chest without announcing itself. I walked home. The wind chime caught a small breath of air as I passed. I heard it this time. The thing about repairing things for a living is that you develop a particular kind of patience. You learn that most problems are problems of accumulated small failures, a screw that turned a quarter inch too far over years of seasonal expansion, a hinge plate that wasn't set deep enough when the house was built. The failure isn't a single moment. It's the whole history of small moments that got you there. You fix it by undoing that history carefully, not by forcing the new thing into place. I thought about that more than I needed to that August. By September we were having a beer on her porch on Friday evenings. That was how it developed. One Friday I was walking back from the truck with a cold one and she was outside and I said, "I don't know why, but this seems like the moment to ask if you want a beer," and she said yes. The next Friday I brought two. By the third Friday it was just understood. Hank came too and learned to like the space under her green chair. She told me, in pieces over those evenings, about her marriage. She'd been married for 6 years. His name was Patrick. He was a civil engineer who worked long hours by choice, not because the job demanded it, she thought, but because being at the job was easier than being wherever the conversation would have gone if he'd come home. She said this plainly, without anger. The way you describe a mechanical failure you've had time to understand. He wasn't cruel, she said. He wasn't even cold exactly. He was just somewhere else. Even when he was in the room. I know that somewhere else, I said. She looked at me. Lauren, I said, my ex-wife, 2 years ago. How long were you married? She said, 7 years. I said. She nodded. Not the kind of nod that means that checks out. The kind that means I understand that duration. We sat with that for a moment. Hank made a sound in his sleep under her chair. The Friday evening settled around us. I noticed, that night, that her coffee mug was on the railing between our chairs. She'd filled it with something cold iced tea. Maybe. Something with mint. The blue-gray bird faced outward. I noticed I'd started thinking of it as a specific object with a specific place in how I understood her. The way you come to understand someone through the constants in their life before you understand anything else. By October she knew I took my coffee black. She knew I was reading whatever happened to be on my nightstand, which at the time was a book about the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge that I kept losing my place in. She knew I hated leaving things half-finished. That I'd stay an extra hour on a job I'd told myself I was leaving at 4. That I had an opinion about deck fasteners that most people would not find interesting, but that she listened to anyway with the specific expression of someone who is actually curious about what makes something matter to another person. She knew I had a sister in Raleigh I talked to twice a week and a mother in Asheville I drove to see every couple of months, and that I was better at showing up than I was at explaining why showing up mattered to me. I knew she read obsessively, not casually. Obsessively. With pencil notes in the margins that I caught glimpses of when she set a book down open-faced. I knew she'd been a textile designer before pivoting to some kind of freelance work she described as helping small businesses figure out what they actually look like, which I took to mean branding and which she confirmed was branding, but that most people found the word too corporate. I knew she talked to her brother every Sunday, that his name was Nico, that he was getting divorced himself and she worried about him in the direct way of someone who's been through it. I knew she ran 6 mornings a week, and on the 7th morning she didn't even get out of bed until 9, and that she considered that non-negotiable. I knew she always held her mug with both hands when she was about to say something she'd been thinking about for a while. One Tuesday evening in early October, she knocked on my door. It was a weeknight. Unexpected. And I answered in a flannel I'd worn to work that day with Hank behind me, interested in whoever it was. She looked like she'd been sitting with something for a few hours. She said, I need to tell you something." I stepped back and let her in. She sat at my kitchen table the first time she'd been inside my house, and she put her hands flat on the table and said, "My ex-husband called me last week. He's moving here." I sat down across from her. "Patrick," she said, "has been offered a position with a firm downtown. He didn't ask me first," she said. "He told me after. He said he'd be professional, that he respected my space, that he wasn't," her hands moved, "he didn't say what he wasn't," she said. "He just said he'd understand if I wanted to talk." "What do you want?" I said. She looked at me. "That's what I've been trying to figure out," she said. What she told me next came out in the careful order of someone who'd been living with the weight of it and was finally choosing to set it down. Patrick hadn't just called to inform her about the job. He'd said, in the conversation, that he thought he'd made a mistake, that he'd spent 2 years understanding what she'd tried to tell him and he hadn't been able to receive at the time, that he wasn't asking for anything, he wanted her to know that he just thought she deserved to hear it from him directly. I asked how long ago the divorce was final. "Almost 3 years," she said. I sat with that. She was watching me with a kind of attention that felt different from our Friday evenings, more exposed. Like she was watching to see what I did with information I hadn't asked for. "Are you thinking about it?" I said. She was quiet for long enough that I knew the answer was complicated. "I don't know," she said, "and then I like my life the way it is right now." I didn't ask what she meant by the way it is right now. I should have. I didn't. Because I thought I understood. And understanding something is not the same as knowing it. The weeks that followed had the quality of something held at a careful angle. She didn't bring Patrick up again and I didn't ask. We kept our Fridays. She came over twice to use my table saw for a project she described as a shelf that had gotten aspirational, which I translated to mean that the shelf had turned into a built-in and she needed a better blade. We worked in the garage for 2 evenings, talking about nothing in particular. And Hank slept in the corner on his good blanket, and the garage smelled like sawdust and machine oil, and it was one of the better evenings I'd had in a long time. I wasn't keeping count, but if I had 3 times she'd showed up at my door unannounced. Always in the evening. Always when she'd been sitting with something. 7 Friday nights on her porch. 11 times I'd seen the mug before any other light was on in her house. One morning when I came outside at 6:15 and she was already on the porch in a coat, and she looked at me and said, "Sleep's been hard." And I said, "Me too." And we stood there for a moment in the early gray of a November morning without saying anything else. And that felt like more than enough. Pay attention to this next part, because somewhere in November, I started making a mistake I didn't know I was making. I'd decided I knew what she needed. Not consciously, I don't want to make myself out to be calculating, because that's not what it was. It was more like I'd built a picture in my mind of the situation, and the picture was she was sorting through something. I was the person she'd found safe to sort through it near. And when she'd sorted through it, she'd either stay here or she'd go back to Patrick, and that was the architecture of it. I was the constant, the shore, the thing that didn't move while she figured out what to do with what was moving. That's a generous picture of yourself. The way I'm telling it now, I know that. The truth underneath that picture, I hadn't asked her anything real. I'd listened, I was good at listening. I'd been told that I'd let myself feel good about that particular quality, but listening is not the same as asking. And asking would have required admitting that the answer mattered to me in a specific way. That what I'd been calling paying attention had been, for a while now, something closer to paying it all forward against a hope I hadn't let myself name. I found out I'd been wrong the 3rd week of November. It was a Friday. Later than usual. We'd been on the porch longer than we normally stayed. It was cold and she'd brought out a blanket and Hank had maneuvered himself under it next to her boots. The traitor. We were talking about her brother Nico, how his divorce had finalized. How he was doing better than she'd expected. How grief comes in strange shapes when what you're grieving is what something could have been rather than what it was. And she said, "I've been talking to Patrick more. I didn't look at her right away. I looked at the yard. She said, "He's been different, or he's trying to be. He has a therapist now," she said, "which is something he would have never done before." She paused. She said, "I don't know what I'm doing. I want you to know that I'm not sure." I said, "What does your gut say?" She held the mug with both hands. She said, "I think I still love him. I think part of me never stopped." I heard that. I heard it the way you hear something you should have accounted for and didn't. The whole structure of how I'd understood the last 7 months shifted slightly. The way a floor shifts when you find the joists below it aren't where you expected. Not a collapse. Just a settling. A new understanding of the load. I said, "Okay." She looked at me. She said, Are you okay?" I said, "Yeah, I'm good." She watched me for a moment with the specific expression of someone who is applying more precision to a response than the response is earning. And she said, "Cole." And I said, "Mara, I'm fine." I wasn't fine, but I was functional. And at 38 in a cold November. Functional is what you lead with. I went inside not long after that. I told her the cold was getting to my neck, which was partially true. Hank came with me reluctantly, looking back over his shoulder at the green chair as if I was making a decision he didn't endorse. I sat at my kitchen table with my hands around a mug of my own, not her mug. My mug. A plain blue thing Lauren had bought at a hardware store and left behind, and I sat there for a long time, not thinking exactly. Just existing in the gap between what I'd been building in my head over 7 months and what the evening had confirmed. I hadn't told her anything. I saw that now. I'd listened, and I'd shown up, and I'd fixed the things that could be fixed. And I had told myself that was enough, and that she knew. And the truth was, I'd never said a word. Not one direct word. I was good at showing up. I'd been told that. What I wasn't good at what Lauren had told me, plainly. In the conversation that happened 3 weeks before she moved out was letting people know I was there on purpose, not just out of habit, not just because it was easy, that the showing up was a choice I was making about them. Lauren had said, "I don't know if you love me or if I'm just the furniture in the room you're most comfortable in." I hadn't had a good answer for that. I still don't know if the answer would have changed anything. But I sat at my table that November night, and I thought about the mug on the porch railing, the bird facing out, and I thought I never said anything. I let the whole architecture develop, and I never said one direct thing. I thought that's the same mistake. That was the first time I understood what the last 7 months had actually been. I didn't sleep much that night. Not in a dramatic way. I wasn't lying there with the ceiling fan turning and my thoughts in free fall. I just woke up at 3 in the morning and couldn't go back under. The way you can't when something has repositioned itself in your chest and hasn't settled yet. Hank moved up from the foot of the bed to the pillow beside me, which he only did when he'd decided I needed company. I let him stay. By 4, I was in the kitchen with the lights low, drinking water, looking at the window above the sink that faced the side yard. Her lights were off. I stood there for a while thinking about what Lauren had said. Not with bitterness, I want to be clear about that. Because I'd done the bitterness in the first year after the divorce, and it hadn't changed anything, and it had made me unpleasant to be around, which Hank had tolerated patiently. What I was thinking about was the specific mechanism of the mistake. The way I'd let my showing up speak for itself when what it needed was a voice. I'd done the same thing in my marriage. I'd been present. I'd fixed the things that needed fixing. I'd come home, and I'd assumed that the presence itself communicated what the presence was, for that she knew I was there on purpose. That I'd chosen her. That the constancy was a declaration rather than just a habit. Lauren had needed to hear it. I'd thought saying it diminished it. That the doing was more real than the saying. She'd needed both. I'd given her one. I looked at the window for a while longer. Then I went back to bed and lay there with Hank's warm weight beside me until the gray started outside and I finally gave up on sleep. The next morning I worked a half day on a job across town, a bathroom remodel I was 2 days from finishing. Tile work. The kind of task that requires enough attention to keep your mind from going somewhere you don't want it to go. I was back by early afternoon. I sat in the truck in my driveway for a few minutes. Then I got out and walked across the yard. She answered the door in a paint-stained sweatshirt with her hair pulled back and the expression of someone who'd also been awake more than they wanted to be. She looked at me. She said, "Come in." I came in. We stood in her kitchen, and I didn't sit down, because I knew if I sat down I'd find a way to make this into another Friday evening conversation, into something comfortable and oblique, into a version of showing up that didn't say why. I said, "I need to tell you something I should have said before now." She set the mug on the counter, both hands free, watching me. I said, "The last 7 months have been some of the better months I've had in a while. And I know that's not dramatic or useful information for what you're trying to figure out. But I've been sitting in my house saying nothing for long enough that I know what it costs. And I'm not willing to do that again." She didn't say anything. She was doing the thing where she files information before she responds. I said, "I'm not asking you to do anything with this. I know you're in the middle of something that's complicated and it's yours to sort out. But I wanted you to know that I know I was here on purpose, that it wasn't proximity, it was a choice." Then I stopped talking, because I'd said the thing, and saying more would have been performance rather than honesty. She looked at me for a long time, not the way you look at someone when you're deciding what to say, the way you look at someone when you're actually seeing them, which is different. She said, "I know." I said, "Okay." She said, "I've known for a while. I didn't know if you knew." I said, "I should have made it clearer." She said, "Yes, you should have." There was no warmth in that. Exactly. Not cruelty either. Just precision. The way she listened applied to me now, directly, and I understood that she'd been waiting a long time for the version of me that showed up in words. She said, "I need some time. I need to figure out what I'm doing with Patrick before I can talk to you honestly about anything else. I want to be honest with you, and right now, I can't be honest with you without being dishonest with myself." I said, "That's fair." She said, "I don't want to lose the Friday evenings." I said, "Me neither." We stood there in her kitchen with the November light thin through the window and Hank outside, presumably sitting by the fence waiting for me to do whatever I was going to do so he could assess the outcome. She reached out and picked up the mug from the counter, the bird mug, the blue-gray bird facing out, and she held it in both hands the way she held it when she was thinking. She didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. And somehow that was enough for right now. I went home. The next 2 weeks were the hardest stretch of the fall. Not because anything changed on the surface, we still waved in the mornings. She still put her lights on before mine. Hank still made his way to the fence when he heard her outside. The Friday evening held. We talked the way we'd always talked. Carefully and honestly, and without going near the thing that was now sitting between us with its name on it. She didn't mention Patrick. I didn't ask. What changed was inside the architecture of it. Something had been named that couldn't be unnamed. And that naming had its own weight, different from the carrying it unnamed weight that I'd been living with. I found myself working longer on the jobs I had, not because they needed more hours, but because coming home to 11 feet of property line and a yard I'd become accustomed to looking at differently was a specific kind of thing to sit with. Hank was not sympathetic. He went to the fence every morning, regardless of what I was feeling about it. And he looked at me with the expression he always used, which communicated that some decisions are simpler than humans make them, and that he'd like his dinner at the usual time. Then, on a Sunday evening in late November, there was a knock at my door. It was Mara. She was in her coat. She was holding the mug, which she rarely brought away from her porch. Her expression was the one I'd learned to read as I've been sitting with something for a while and I've made a decision. She said, "Can we walk?" We walked, down the block, around the loop that went past the elementary school and the small park with the dead fountain. Back around. Hank came. The November evening was cold and clear, and our breath showed, and neither of us said much for the first 10 minutes. Just walked. which is sometimes the kindest thing you can do before you say something. Then she said, I talked to Patrick yesterday. I looked at her. She said, I told him I didn't think we should see each other, that I knew he'd changed. Or was changing. That I believed him. But that I needed my life to be mine right now in a way it hadn't been for a long time. And that I couldn't figure out what mine meant while there was a version of before still standing in the room. I said, how did he take it? She was quiet for a step or two. She said, he was sad. He was honest. He said he understood and he didn't believe it, but he said it. And then she said he's a good man. He was just a good man who wasn't there. And that distinction matters to me. I didn't say anything. She said, I'm not telling you this so you'll think it's about you. It's not about you. It's about me knowing what I need my life to look like for a while. And part of knowing that is she stopped walking for a moment and looked at the dark street ahead of us. Part of knowing that is I couldn't stop thinking about what you said in my kitchen. I looked at her. She said, I've been alone in the careful way. Cole. For 3 years. I've been very disciplined about protecting the version of myself that survived the marriage. And then you came across the yard to fix a closet door and you never pretended it was about the closet door. But you also never said it wasn't. And she stopped. She held the mug against her chest with both hands. She said, I don't want to be careful in a way that costs me the wrong things. I said, what does that mean for right now? She said, it means I think we should stop pretending Friday evenings are all this is. We stood there on the sidewalk outside the elementary school with Hank, sitting at our feet, looking between us with the patience of someone who has been trying to communicate a very simple thing for several months, and is relieved. Someone's finally getting to it. I said, okay. She said, okay. We walked home. When we got to the place where the walk diverges her door, my door, she stopped and looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, and then she did something I didn't expect. She held out the mug. I looked at it, then at her. She said, the bird is a Steller's jay. I've been meaning to tell you that for a while. I took the mug. I looked at the bird. Blue-gray. Painted simple. One small wing lifted. I said, I'll return it in the morning. She said, I know you will. She went inside. I stood in the cold with the mug in my hands and Hank beside me and the whole November night still and clear overhead. And I didn't think very much. I just felt the weight of the ceramic in my palms and thought about a bird with one wing lifted. And whether that was about landing or about leaving. I went inside. I put the mug on my windowsill. In the morning when I woke up, it was the first thing I saw when the light came in. The Steller's jay with one wing lifted. Facing the window. Facing her house. I stood there for a minute. Then I made coffee. Poured it into the mug. And took it back across the yard. She opened the door before I knocked. She'd been watching. Or she'd heard Hank. Or she'd just known the way she seemed to know things about the yard and what moved through it. She looked at the mug in my hands, and she looked at me. I said, I thought you might want coffee. She said, I already have some. Then she opened the door the rest of the way. I came in. Sometimes the thing you've been afraid to say takes 7 months and one cold November walk to get out. And sometimes the person who changes the quiet of your life doesn't do it with anything dramatic. They just keep light on before yours and hold a coffee mug with both hands and wait to see if you're going to be honest. Have you ever been ready to say something for months but let the saying of it stay inside where it felt safer? I'd like to know I'm not the only one. Drop it in the comments, I read them all. If this one stayed with you, leave a like. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.